Very conscious of the people that followed here. I think it's been very comprehensive, really, what we've heard so far. I think we've got a mix of people coming from a political activist background, somebody like, social political activist, somebody like I think from Rita and Billy, we've got very unique perspectives from people who are very active and if you like the boldface. And obviously Kevin, and we've got a mastery, I think both of you really, so kind of really it's very difficult to follow on that. I suppose what I wanted to talk about tonight was kind of much more general, but I did want to touch on some things, and Kevin has probably much more comprehensively dealt with it, but there are some general points that I can make, both looking at the historical perspective of 1913 and how it fits into that historical narrative of Ireland in the early 20th century. And also, I'd like to kind of make some general points about how that fits into the Ireland of 2013 and, if you like, what its message is for the Ireland of today. I think, as Kevin alluded to earlier, I noted myself in recent weeks, in particular, as 1913 has been more and more discussed as we've approached the centenary of the beginning of the strike. The stridency of some, what I refer to as official historians, if you like, a number of whom I would have a certain regard for, particularly people like Dermot Ferret, I have a certain respect for. And I noticed with him in particular, and I probably some others I would dismiss more readily, but he would be someone I have respect for. And I noticed an unusual stridency from him. He was taken part recently in a documentary in 1913 on RT Radio 1, and he was very strident in dismissing any link between 1913 and 1916, and made very, for an historian, very unusual, made very sweeping, generalized statements, which anyone would study or consider history realizes it's a very dangerous thing to do. But he was doing that and dismissing any notion of a link, and that in itself, not only is simplistic and unhistorical, but I feel it should arouse suspicion as to what's going on here, what's the agenda. Why would somebody like Dermot Ferret come out with this? And I think it's quite evident, and even in this room, I think understand what's going on there. As Kevin said, I think what's here is the dynamics of state power, and our history and the narrative of how we arrived at where we are today is a very important tool in that narrative of the state, in shaping how we view our world today. So it's very clear that they want to control this decade of centenary, and they want to control how we interpret it and how we read it, and most particularly, obviously, the lessons that we draw from it. So while arguments can be made downplaying the link, I think it's very important to point out that it would be wrong to suggest that the two events can in any way be viewed in isolation from each other, and particularly outside the context of that revolutionary decade of 1913 to 23. So I think, in terms of where we are and in terms of the fight that we have on our hands, that's a part of that fight in terms of how we shape that history and take control of it, if you like, democratize history and take it out of the hands of the elite. The first thing I suppose I want to look at very briefly, and just a very quick overview, would be how 1913 fits into that overall narrative of republicanism. And I think the Republican tradition, and again, Kevin alluded to that strand of republicanism, drawing on Connolly's famous quote, which Kevin gave us there, the cause of Ireland is the cause of Labour, and the cause of Labour is the cause of Ireland. But Irish republicanism, from its very origins in the Society of the United Irishmen, particularly leaders like Tone, were very conscious of where the Republican tradition and where the Republican movement drew its strength. And there was from, in the words of Tone, a large and respectable body, quote, the men have no property, unquote, or the men and women have no property, to give it maybe a more politically correct 21st century view. But, whatever, people like Tone, Emmett, Lawler, James Smith and Lawler in the 1840s, these particular leaders, and others, people like Jemmy Hope in the 1790s and so on, particularly would pick out, were very conscious of that strong social right and the importance of it to the Republican struggle. And in their writings, very much stressed that linking of the common social and economic and political struggles of the people with the national demand for political independence. And for instance, a document which is very much overlooked is the Emmett's. We hear much of the speech from the doc, which in itself is a fine piece of oratory, but the actual proclamation, which Emmett, particularly, there were other hands involved, but particularly Emmett, drafted his proclamation of 1803, which for the time that it was written in was quite an amazing and revolutionary document, which talked about, for instance, confiscating church lands, abolishing tithes, and putting the lands under state control, of subordinating the right to private property to the public good, using language that would be later on echoed in the 1916 proclamation. Indeed, the 1916 proclamation in many ways draws much of its inspiration from that proclamation of 1803. Likewise, James Clinton Lawler in the 1840s realised that linking the struggle of the people for control of land was a vital link to make between that and the national demand for independence, because he saw that the means by which people could be mobilised and by which people could be harnessed into a broader, stronger national movement. And again, Lawler again was one of those people who had that vision and realised and could make that link. Likewise, the Fenian movement, the IRB, as it was founded in 1858, also people, particularly like James Stephens, who travelled to, in the aftermath of the 1848 rising, travelled to Paris, and John O'Mahony and others, came very much under the influence of the radical movements in Europe at the time, and brought that back with them, and very much fed that into the development of the Fenian movement. So, like for instance, James Stephens and O'Mahony were members of the First International. They very much again were very conscious of the importance of linking the national demand with the social and economic advancement of the Irish people. That one without the other really was something that would be a movement that would be, if you like, were the two wheels necessary to bring the movement forward. And for instance, and just a very brief quote to give you from James Connolly, for instance, and he refers to what Robert Emmett had to say. And he talked about the Emmett Rebellion in terms of describing it as more of a working class character than any of his predecessors. And I think Connolly very much could see that revolutionary strand of republicanism, and saw it very important to make those links and to develop those links. Likewise, people like Peter Beresford Ellis, quoting Marx, Marx himself, Karl Marx, very early on recognised the revolutionary potential of the Fenian movement, and realised that whilst others were dismissing it as simply a nationalist movement, saw very much in it its international character, but also its revolutionary potential. That Fenian movement very much, particularly people like Stephens and others, saw the revolutionary potential, for instance, of the Land League campaign, and it was through people like Michael Davitt and others who made that vital link again between what was happening on the land with the whole strife for political independence, because they realised that political independence in itself would merely be an abstract for many people without linking it to the common issues of the day. And again, it was something which sent shockwaves through the heart of the political establishment, many of whom would go on to be part of that home rule political establishment that Kevin was referring to earlier on, which in 1913 was battling to shape the kind of new Ireland that would emerge after home rule. So the involvement of the Fenian movement at the time of the Land League was something which really made that political class very, very uncomfortable. Quickly turning to the 1913 lockout within the broader Republican separatist movement. Again, I think it's possible here to follow a thread that links the more progressive radical wing of the movement with support, or passive or more active support, for the lockout. And I think that's interesting, because if you follow that thread, and again, Kevin refers to this earlier on, if you follow that thread right through to 1921-22 when the establishment of the Free State, in many cases within that nationalist Republican movement, you can see almost the demarcation lines, if you like, of where different people came down on those big questions. Now, a number of them obviously died during 1916, but if you like, that radical revolutionary tradition, by and large, represented by people such as Pearse, Eamon Khan, Sean McDermott, supported the lockout. And if you like, they or their political successors ultimately were those who opposed the establishment of the Free State, recognising in it essentially a gone-bean state, one that certainly didn't represent their revolutionary idealism. What is more conservative figures such as Andrew Griffith virulently opposed the lockout and the trade union movement. And again, it's no coincidence that obviously Griffith and his political successors were those who laid the foundation stones of the Free State. So even there, within, if you like, that Republican separatist movement, you can see there the fault lines, if you like, developing, which will become much more evident in 1921-22. Indeed, writing during 1913, Pearce had this to say about the lockout, and I quote, "I do not know whether the methods of Mr. James Larkin are wise methods or unwise methods," and in brackets he writes, "unwise, I think, in some respects. But this I know, that there is a most hideous wrong to be righted, and that the man who attempts honestly to right it is a good man and a brave man," unquote. Likewise, Conley and Larkin recognised the threat posed by cultural imperialism as well as economic and political imperialism. And I think there's a quote here I'd just like to share with you from Conley, and I think it's quite apt. And in it he talks about the Irish language movement and its importance to that general sweep of revolution that was then taking place in Ireland. And writing in the Workers' Republic, he says, like, quote, "Those who drop Irish in favour of English are generally actuated by the meanest of motives, and are lickspittles, desirous of aping degention, whereas the rank and file of the Gaelic movement are for the most part thoroughly democratic in sentiment and spirit," unquote. So, you know, it's evident there that, and again, as Kevin alluded to, that general labour movement, that trade union movement, was not simply one that was grounded purely on the social conditions of the day, obviously the vital plank in its platform, but also was making those important links between the issues of political, social, economic freedom, and obviously particularly developed by people economy. Now, I suppose in such a brief space, it's impossible to adequately address all of the important dynamics that were at play between organised labour and the advanced Republican movement. But I think it's suffice it to say that there is a tangible link that suggests that 1913 cannot be viewed outside the context of that revolutionary decade. And I think that's something that needs to be emphasised. And I think as we approach 1916, I think all of those vital links need to be emphasised and need to be talked about. I suppose looking a bit more to what's happening today and how we look at it, again, looking at 1913, Republicans would refer to 1916 as unfinished business, and I think we could likewise look to 1913 as unfinished business. Again, I'm drawing on, and I certainly didn't confer with Kevin when I was doing this, but I'm actually drawing on, let's say, an article, Brian Hanley, writing in the current edition of History Ireland. He points out that 1913 was a struggle, again, as we were talking about and I quote, class and power, with home rule on the horizon at last, about which class would dominate self-governing Ireland, unquote. And I think in this respect, I believe that it carries a serious message about who controls the levers of economic and political power in Ireland today, because I think the foundation stones were laid in 1913, and as I said, were particularly important in the context of the establishment of the Free State in 1922-23. If you like, the political class that seized power then are still here today. I think as Malachy referred to earlier on, for instance, the Butterley family, who ultimately went on to own Stardust and the links with Charles J. Haughey and Fianna Fáil and so on. Many of those same links and threads are there and are evident and continue down through the decades, through that century. So I think all of those things are important to consider when we're looking at this as history, because it's not merely history, it has relevance for where we are today. And I think that's something that the establishment certainly don't want us to talk about. They want us to kind of package this up quite conveniently as something that happened 100 years ago, and we can look back on it very sentimentally, but there's no relevance for who we are. And of course, it's the opposite of that we need to do. We need to engage with this in a really active way. 1913, I suppose, was a moment in Irish history which would prove to be a signpost to what an organised and politicised Irish working class could achieve. And I suppose it heralded the collective drive of the Irish people for political as well as social and economic freedom in the following decade. It was a crucial moment when political resolve of the trade union movement, both its leadership and its members, was tested in the white heat battle, and it was not found wanting, crucially. And indeed, writing in the Irish Worker on August 30, 1913, James Connolly set out in clear terms the issues that were at stake and what the role of the radical trade union movement should be. And I think these are words that are very relevant today, and indeed are relevant for those denizens of Liberty Hall and others within the trade union leadership. And I quote, "The fault of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, what is it? Let us tell it in plain language. Its fault is this, that it found the labourers of Ireland on their knees, and has striven to raise them to the erect position of manhood. It found them with all the vices of slavery in their souls, and it strove to eradicate those vices, and replace them with some of the virtues of free men. It found them with no other weapons of defence than the arts of the lyre, the lickspittle, and toy, and it combined them and taught them to abhor those arts, and rely proudly on the defensive power of combination. It, in short, found a class in whom 7 centuries of social outlawry added fresh degradations upon the burden it bore as the members of a nation suffering from the cumulative effects of 7 centuries of national bondage. And out of this class, the degraded slaves of slaves, more degraded still, for what degradation is more abysmal than that of those who prostitute their manhood on the altar of profit-mongering. Out of this class of slaves, the labourers of Dublin, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union has created an army of intelligent, self-reliant men, abhorring the old arts of the toy, the lickspittle, and the crawler, and trusting alone to the disciplined use of their power to labour or to withdraw their labour to assert and maintain their right as men, and quote. I think those words are very powerful, and I think all the more powerful because they remain relevant today. Because today we lie in the grip of not only the imperialism of British occupation in the 6 occupied counties, but we also have here in this part of Ireland the new imperialism of the EU, the ECB and the IMF, who through the agency, the active collaboration of the 26 county political and economic elite, are today waging a war of violence and economic conquest and theft against their own people. And I think it's in all of this that the spotlight falls on the leadership of the trade union movement in Ireland. And in that we can only say, and I say this myself as a member of the trade union movement, as a member of SITU, that it has failed in its duty and has fallen far short of the high standards of decisive and visionary leadership set by people such as Conley and Larkin. And in contrast, they have embarked on a campaign of containing the righteous anger of Irish working people, and instead seek to dissipate it in meaningless marches with no effective strategy of economic resistance, even being discussed, let alone formulated and implemented. And in this regard, for instance, I give a personal experience, one that I experienced only about 4 weeks ago. It was a seminar held in Situ College, to which was invited, amongst others, Labour TD for Louth, Jordan Nash. And he was wheeled out to tell the workers' representatives, shop stewards and others, that in terms of lobbying TDs, that they need to show respect if they want to have their case listened to. And that they should maybe consider organising photo opportunities, if you like, to soothe the egos of these TDs, to curry favour with their political masters. And I looked about the room to see if was anybody is. First of all, I was kind of I was shocked, and then I went from that to anger, and then I kind of went to a kind of amusement about it, because I was amazed that nobody I was actually willing to kind of let somebody else speak on this, and eventually I just couldn't hold my tongue any longer, and I had to ask him, like, was he for real? What world did he live in? And how often did he come out of Leinster House to experience what it was for the lives of ordinary people? And his answer to me was, had I ever engaged in lobbying before, because he always found this very effective. So at that point, I really didn't see much point continuing the discussion. But to me, it summed up, the political class and the arrogance of the political class, and if you like, the linking between them and the trade union. And there was a mass march organised by the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. It was about maybe 50,000-60,000 people took part, filled up Common Street. And I remember as people like Neil Begg or Big Two and Jack O'Connor or Sister were being introduced to the crowd, they were booed. And to me, that summed up, there was something rotten at the heart of the trade union movement. And it's quite a dangerous thing to have happen. And it must have been music to the ears of the political establishment to realise that they had a trade union leadership that at that stage were, if you like, had been neutered, and they were that much out of touch with their constituency that really these people could very easily be sidelined. And it also showed that at a time when decisive leadership was needed, leadership that could be trusted and one that was decisive and visionary and courageous, that it wasn't there. And it showed that we were really living in very, very dangerous times. And I think that since, in the 5 years since, I think we've seen that. I suppose, just to wrap up on that, the wheezing words of conciliation that we hear now, replacing those words, those fiery words of organisation and revolution, are certainly not what is required today.
What is required today, I believe, is a language that will fire the soul and embolden the spirit of the people to resist. You know, I think if we were to draw anything from 1913, and indeed from that entire revolutionary generation, from 1913 to 23, it is that ability to organise and to resist and to think independently. I think if we were to really truly honour those people in that generation, I think that's the lesson that we need to take up and to act on. Using the words of, and taking the words of Sean O'Casey, when he talked about that early trade union movement, he said it was time for words, not for an assignation with peace, dark obedience or passive resignation, but trumpet tongue of resistance to wrong, discontent with zeroing poverty, and defiance of any power strutting out to stand in the way of their march onward. Those may seem lofty words, but there are times maybe where you do need to reach for the stars, where you do need to look above the mundane. And I think we in Ireland are at such a time. I think working people in Europe and in the world are at such a time. I think that's exactly what we need to do, rather than listen to those conciliatory words which we hear whispered in our ears telling us to bide our time. You know, working people were told to bide their time during the boom because they were told that they could, by unreasonable demands that they were put, endanger that boom and endanger the profits that were being made. But of course, when the profits were being privatised, when the losses came about, they were socialised, and we were all told we had to share in the losses. So I think those times have passed. I think it's time, as we approach that centenary of 1916, as we commemorate and celebrate and draw the lessons of 1913, I think we have to be conscious of our role in the vanguard of that resistance to those twin imperialisms. I think we have to look at what 1916 and what 1913, and indeed that decade of revolution has to say to the people and to the Ireland of today. James Connolly described Liberty Hall as the unconquered citadel of the Irish working class, and I think it's a travesty to see what has been reduced to today. You know, I think that is who we're to be as Irish workers, as trade unionists, as political activists, as community activists. That's what we need to strive for. I think we need to prove ourselves equal to what is facing us today, what is facing us in the coming decade. Because I think we're celebrating a proud legacy that's been bequeathed to us. But we must prove ourselves worthy of that legacy. And I'd like to conclude now with the words of James Connolly, because I believe that they are as relevant today as when first penned by Connolly in 1916. And I think they should be, if you like, used by us as our political compass in the years, in the weeks, the months, the years ahead. And I finish with these words. The cause of labour is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is the cause of labour. They cannot be dissevered. Ireland seeks freedom. Labour seeks that an Ireland free should be sole mistress of her own destiny, supreme owner of all material things within and upon her side. God be the